Hello, my name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I also happen to be a political scientist that studies Russia. And just in the past week, we can see the bloody trail of Vladimir Putin around the world. And it's worth taking note of because it might totally change the way you think of the war in Ukraine. Russia is currently waging a bloody battle to take the city of Pokrovsk, Ukraine, a town that before the war only had a population of about 60,000 people. Yet today, Russia is losing up to 1,000 soldiers a day just to take the city. And it's not one that has a massive strategic value as far as the battlefield goes, according to experts with whom I've spoken, including General Ben Hodges. So what really motivates Russia? Pokrovsk is also home to one of Ukraine's largest coal mines. If that coal mine were to be taken by Russia, it would mean that Ukraine would go from having about 7.5 million tons of coal produced a year to only 2 to 3 million tons. And why that's important? Well, Russia is trying to corner the steel industry. The Russian steel industry, unlike other industries, has not been nearly as affected by sanctions. In fact, there's been some in Europe who've been trying to remove sanctions on Russian steel. Russia produces about 11.6 million tons of steel per year. It knows very well that if it continues to put pressure on Ukraine, which dropped from the 14th biggest steel manufacturer in the world to 24th just in the past couple of years, then it will be able to deprive Ukraine of an important source of revenue. Keep in mind, if steel from Ukraine was 1/3 of all exports, what will Ukraine do if it's no longer able to export steel? Or the steel from Ukraine, due to lack of coal, is simply too expensive. Europeans will be simply forced to buy the steel coming from Russia. And that's a strategy that Russia has. How can we make the Europeans have no other option but to remove sanctions and allow the Russian economy to further expand? This is not surprising for Russia. Keep in mind, they've taken other cities in the past, specifically because of the natural resources that they produce. Russia is keen to cripple Ukraine economically. The gameplay here is that how is it that we, Russia, can take as much of the territory of Ukraine that has strategic value or natural resource value so that Ukraine is not able to develop in any significant way, but would be broken down and on its knees, and thus allow Russia the opportunity after the war to begin its propaganda again with the Ukrainian population, trying to convince them that the only way forward is to work with Russia. But let's look internationally. Where else do we see Russia's influence? Well, it's already come out in multiple reports in the US government that Russia is trying to influence the US elections. We know very well that Russia is also supporting a number of political parties in Europe. We see the proxies for Putin, whether it's on Hungary or in Slovakia, where even a member of the European Parliament from there went to Moscow just a couple of days ago to express his sorrow that Europe was so rough on Russia. And one of the instruments that Russia has routinely used in order to generate support for far-right parties and for populists, and those who are Eurosceptic or skeptical about NATO, is the same: illegal immigration. We've seen that in the case of Europe. Russia successfully used illegal immigrants, which they sent via Belarus, which they sent via other countries, to make sure that there was going to be a hysteria about a surge of illegal immigration. It's well documented that Russia was very supportive of trying to help tons and tons of Syrian refugees who became refugees because of Russia's involvement in the civil war in Syria to get to Europe. This was all done to create an anti-immigrant backlash, something that they knew would back the parties or assist the parties which Putin wished to see in power. And we see the same thing in North America. Today, Nicaragua, a close ally of Russia, continues to be a major transit point for Latin American immigrants who are seeking to illegally enter the United States. But why right now? Well, as everyone has noticed, illegal immigration is one of the top issues in the US elections. Russia has a very keen interest to make sure that the elections turn out in favor of one candidate over the other. But that's not where it stops. It gets much more dangerous. In the case of Venezuela, for instance, which Russia recently was able to assist after Nicolas Maduro lost the elections and there was popular uprisings, The Putin regime sent down consultants to assist it how to maintain power. And it's because Venezuela has been a very good ally of Russia. In fact, Venezuela was one of the major sources of gold bought up by Hezbollah before the October 7th attacks. That gold was then sold in the Middle East for cash. That cash helped to finance the attacks. And do you think that Russia supported those attacks? Well, just days after October 7th, Moscow invited the leadership of Hamas to come to Moscow to meet with them to discuss, while the rest of the world was in shock. And it's probably not by complete chance that the attacks, October 7th, happened to fall on Putin's birthday. Across Latin America, we see that Russia continues to operate with other rogue actors, and not just state actors like Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, which are under enormous sanctions. There's another market that it has, and that's with other organizations that are operating in the gray area or just illegally. That includes drug cartels and other radical organizations in Latin America that seek to foment unrest. The objective always being the same: to create divisions in the society and also to use them as proxies for Russia's war against the West. The role of Iran is especially dangerous, not only because Iran exports terrorism and assists Russia in laundering money, as it does for other criminal organizations and terrorist groups around the world, but because it also does supply drones to Russia, which are used to attack Ukraine. We know that Iran is collecting data from those drone attacks, something that helps them to correct and to improve their drones, something that will help create future attacks against other US allies in the Middle East. In all of this, Russia sees a gain. It knows that it cannot beat NATO in a serious confrontation, a military confrontation, but it knows it can do what's necessary to destabilize the countries that pose a risk to it, those that could in fact destabilize Russia. Keep in mind, Putin's singular objective in this life is to make sure that he maintains power. And he can't do it with a hot war. So he tries his very best to do it with asymmetrical warfare and to do things like information campaigns or the use of illegal immigrants and other things like this, just below the threshold necessary to provoke a real live hot war, something that Putin realizes he doesn't need and he would lose. But then we look at Russia's other allies. Specifically, let's look at what's happening in Asia. Just recently, it's come out that North Korea is sending troops to Russia, both to receive training, but also to assist with weapon systems that the North Koreans have sent. This seems bad, but it gets worse when you find out that North Korea, it appears, is sending thousands more soldiers to participate in actual battles on the side of Russia against Ukraine. The North Korean dictator is keen to have soldiers that are battle tried. He wants to have soldiers who have fought in the winter and know what hard conditions are like. This is probably a bad sign, as simultaneously, we see that North Korea intends to blow up all the roads that connect it with South Korea. Why is that happening now? Well, I don't think it's completely by coincidence that China has also begun its war games around Taiwan. Now, once again, the West is distracted. It has North Korea to worry about, but also has China and Taiwan to worry about. The Chinese, it appears, wish to encircle Taiwan to show strength, to scare the locals, but also it hopes to provoke Taiwan to respond militarily. That would give China everything it needs necessary to begin an actual war, or, at the very least, a total economic blockade of the island. An economic blockade of Taiwan would be truly disastrous. Taiwan can count on Western support if it's attacked militarily. But if it's an economic blockade, who's going to start a war with China because of an economic blockade? Nobody's willing to take that sort of a risk. And we've seen that the West's red lines ultimately mean nothing when it really comes down to it. Everybody's trying to avoid a war. So when we look at what's happening globally, it's important to note, though it might not have made in Russia written right on it, there's usually Russian fingerprints, whether it comes to what's happening in Asia or the Middle East, even Latin America, or the States, or Europe. Russia is intent on destabilizing the world order that we've created. Russia's intention is to work with any sort of actor necessary, be it a terrorist or a drug cartel, to make sure that the West is not able to continue doing business as usual. because Russia knows that's the only way that it can become competitive. It can't do it militarily, it can't do it economically, it can't do it politically. But if it does it in such a way that doesn't raise enough attention that the West will respond militarily, it doesn't allow things to boil over to that point, then it'll probably get away with it. And this is the strategy long term. How do we chip away support for the international institutions that have been created in the post World War II era? The rise of BRICS, as an example, means to do just that. How is it that Russia can take away Western influence? So, in conclusion, what does it really mean? It means that Russia has a game plan here that's much bigger than what many people see. And it's not just about the battlefield in Ukraine. That's certainly an important part of it, and why it's so important to defeat Russia now in Ukraine. Because when Russia is not defeated, and when the West's red lines are trampled over, we see that rogue states like Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela rejoice. And they don't back down. They don't feel there's going to be a status quo. Rather, they become more belligerent and they push the line further and further and further. Thus, if we wish to prevent what is coming, and it will come, which is be a large conflict, perhaps provoked by China and Taiwan, perhaps provoked by Iran and Israel, Russia knows that it would be a destabilizing event for the West. And when Western countries he and haw as to how to respond and don't send the support they guaranteed, such as what they hope to see happen here in Ukraine, then they can count on the Western world order starting to collapse. And that's why now, more than ever, it's important to note that our enemies are working against us. Back in Ukraine now is the only way that we can guarantee our security for years to come, because it's the most stark sign that we can show the other rogue nations how serious we are and that we're not playing games. Thank you.